The air was not just cold, it was ancient cold, a mineral chill that carried the smell of wet granite and earthworm dirt, and pine needles rotting for 100 years. This was the Grafenwoehr Training Area, a vast stretch of Bavarian woodland that the American Army had claimed but never truly tamed. It was 1988, and the Cold War had paused here, turning soldiers into silent watchers and live fire ranges into ghost forests. The 4 members of Raptor One moved slowly, deliberately through the dark. Their mission was deep reconnaissance, a week-long exercise into navigation and surveillance. Sergeant Miller, the team leader, felt the dampness soaking into the heavy fabric of his fatigues. He could taste the metallic residue of the night. The fear and the dust mingled on his tongue. He kept his rifle shouldered, the weight a familiar anchor. He reminded himself that the rifle carried only blanks for training purposes. No live ammunition. It was peacetime protocol, a rule designed to soothe the nerves of politicians and generals, but one that felt deeply insulting and dangerously naive out here, beneath the indifferent gaze of the moon. Miller paused, lifting a hand. The other 3 men stopped, instantly melting into the shadows of the thick fir trees. Specialist Diaz, Private First Class Reyes, and Corporal Hayes understood the rhythm of Miller's anxiety. It was their anxiety too, a shared breath held in the darkness. The silence here was the problem. It was an oceanic silence, a pressure cooker kiwi that should not exist in a healthy forest. There were no crickets, no owls, no distant rustling of deer. It was a vacuum of sound that pressed in on the eardrums, making the soldiers hear the loud, wet beat of their own hearts instead. Miller rotated his head, slowly scanning the tree line. The night vision goggles coated the world in shades of sea-sickly green, a color that made everything look half-decayed and alien. He whispered the essential details into the radio mic. A clipped report confirming their location and status. The reply was clean and immediate, but the voice was too distant, too sterile to offer any real comfort. They were alone. That was the primary truth of this place. They were isolated in a forest that felt less like an ecosystem and more like an enormous waiting room. Reyes, the youngest member of the squad, was running perimeter checks with his own thermal scope, a piece of equipment that sensed heat signatures. He swung the scope methodically across the quadrant, focused on the deep woods that sloped down toward a narrow ravine. The thermal scope was supposed to be a tool of clarity, revealing the warm-blooded life hidden by the dark. It showed the cold trunks of the trees, the slightly warmer rocks, the patches of ground that retained the faint heat of the previous day. For 20 minutes, it showed nothing unexpected, a field of cool green absence. Reyes found himself letting his mind drift, lulled by the hypnotic movement of the scope and the dull, repetitive thrumming of his own pulse. He was thinking about a girl back in the States, the scent of her cheap perfume, the memory of the diner coffee they shared. It was a mental distraction, a necessary escape from the heavy reality of the forest. This was the moment it happened. The moment the familiar became wrong. As the scope swept past a thick cluster of old, crooked oaks at the 100-meter mark, a place where the shadows seemed to coagulate, Reyes saw it. A brief flash of pale warmth. Not the defined block of heat that marked an animal or a hidden soldier. It was an amorphous stain of heat, a long, irregular shape that registered and then vanished. It was too pale to be a deer. It was too long to be a rabbit. It was simply a flicker, a flaw in the thermal feed. Reyes blinked, rubbing his eyes and sweeping the scope back to the cluster of oaks. The thermal display was blank again. Nothing. Just the cold, skeletal shapes of the trees. He held the scope there for a full minute, searching for the slightest return of that signature. He tried to rationalize it. A hot rock cooling down. The residual heat from a jet passing far overhead. A trick of the eye caused by his own fatigue. The reasons were plentiful and easily accepted by the mind designed for survival and denial. But the fear that had been building slowly in the air, the psychological pressure of the deep silence, now coalesced into a sharp point of alarm. The silence of the forest was not empty. It felt like a deliberate act, a held breath. The woods were not unaware of their presence. The woods were simply waiting for the proper moment to acknowledge it. Reyes did not move or speak. He simply held the scope trained on the empty space and let the chilling facts settle in his stomach. He was no longer certain if the pale warmth had vanished. It might simply be that the thing was not moving. The thing was just standing there outside the range of his vision, at the thermal edge of the darkness. It was watching. Reyes felt the cold sweat begin to bead on his forehead, despite the low temperature of the night air. He knew he had to report it, but the words felt too large, too unbelievable to speak aloud. The thermal signature had been too thin, too elongated to be any creature he had ever been trained to observe. He lowered the scope slightly, but kept his eyes locked on the trees. The mission had changed from surveillance to something predatory. The hunters were now the observed. Miller shifted his weight slightly, a quiet sound of suspicion in the darkness. Reyes knew his silence would only last so long before his sergeant demanded an update. He opened his mouth to give a status report, a simple statement about the continued nothingness. But he could not bring himself to lie. The memory of the pale flicker was too strong. The terror was rooted in the knowledge that for a fraction of a second, the scope had shown him something that did not belong on this earth, or perhaps that belonged here long before humanity evolved. He took a single deep, shaky breath and prepared to report the impossible truth that would shatter the facade of the exorcism and plunge them into the deep core of the fear that saturated this ancient German wood. Reyes lowered the thermal scope and spoke quietly into the gloom, a sound barely louder than the deep, ragged intake of his breath. "Sergeant Miller, I have a thermal anomaly," he said. A flicker, one time only. Did not look like a standard signature. Probably a faulty feed. Miller did not acknowledge the technical exploit. He knew Reyes was not a man to mistake a hot battery for an animal. He nodded slowly. "Describe it." Reyes swallowed the dryness in his throat. It was pale, too long and too thin, like stretched heat. It was gone before I could lock on, but it was there in the 100-meter range by the 3 bent oaks. Miller understood the unsaid part of the report. It was something Reyes could not explain, but something he believed with the solid certainty of terror. The sergeant signaled forward. They adjusted their course, cutting slightly left, moving away from the area of the impossible sighting, but heading deeper into a less traversable sector of the woods. This was the restricted ground, a place marked on the training maps, with crosshatching that indicated unexploded ordnance and forgotten fortifications from a war that ended long ago. It was an area where the earth was scarred by old violence and where the trees grew too tall and too close together. The ground underfoot shifted from spongy moss to slick, loose shale, making every step a potential betrayer. The psychological discomfort settled over them like a cold, wet shroud. They had left the perfect silence of the previous sector, only to enter a zone where their own noise was amplified by the close growth. The crunch of their boots on the dried leaves was a startling sound, a percussion that felt terrifyingly loud in the confined space. The rhythmic rasp of their breathing sounded like a small panicked machine in the night. Every scrape of fabric against bark, every accidental click of equipment, was a violent breach of the peace. The silence had been oppressive, but this new soundscape of a self-betrayal was worse. It made every man acutely aware of their physical presence, a presence that was too loud, too warm, too alive for this cold place. Miller moved with the studied precision of a man trying to silence his own body. He remembered the briefings before the exercise. The warnings were not just about mines and old bunkers. There were also the low-voiced warnings from the German liaison officers about local folklore. Do not disturb the old things, they were told. Do not camp near the ancient stones. Do not leave gifts for the forgotten dead. Miller had dismissed them as quaint superstition, part of the necessary cultural exchange. Now the words felt heavy, and real warnings against trespass into a realm that did not obey the rules of the 1988 Army. He whispered a command to Hayes, the demolition and ordnance expert. Watch for anything unnatural, Corporal. Anything that looks like a marker or a sign of ritual. Hayes nodded, his eyes sweeping the ground ahead with meticulous care. Hayes used his night vision to focus on the immediate foreground, studying the imperfections of the green-tinted world. The night vision goggles were a blessing, but they created their own form of paranoia. They flattened the world, stripping it of color and depth. Everything was rendered in shades of radioactive green, beautiful and deeply unsettling. The goggles created shadows where none existed and turned dead branches into waiting figures. The technology gave sight, but it stole the truth of the light, leaving them focused on an imperfect artificial reality. Specialist Diaz moved to Miller's left, the third man in the patrol. Diaz was usually a steady presence, calm and focused. But tonight he was twitchy, moving his head quickly from side to side, like a restless animal. He hated the way the night vision made his eyes water, the constant low-level hiss the goggles emitted. He stopped suddenly, one hand going up to touch the bridge of his nose, where the heavy rubber of the goggles rested. "What is that smell?" He mumbled, the question directed to the ground, and not to the sergeant. Miller paused, breathing deeply, but only detected the familiar scent of cold pine sap and damp mold. "What smell, Diaz?" Diaz wrinkled his nose, the action barely visible in the dark. "It is like old spoiled meat, something sharp and sour. But under that, it is like wet dog, and something else, something yoppery." Miller did not smell it, but he trusted the sharpness of Diaz's sense. Diaz's father had been a butcher, and he carried a finely tuned aversion to the smell of decay and spilled blood. Miller scanned the ground again, unable to reconcile the stillness of the air with the sudden report of the foul odor. They were miles from any known farm or settlement. The only animal they should encounter here was native wild game, and perhaps the occasional fox or badger. There should be nothing to create the smell of raw meat and wet dog, except a fresh kill. The suggestion of blood and carnage injected a new, visceral kind of fear into the patrol, a fear that bypassed the intellectual terror of the thermal flicker and went straight to the survival instinct. They were no longer worrying about an equipment malfunction or an existential ghost. They were worried about a predator, a creature that hunted and killed with terrifying efficiency. The cold ground felt slick beneath their boots, not just from moisture, but from an imagined residue of something else, something foul and unseen. The thought of that smell, the combination of raw decay and the unmistakable scent of a powerful animal, lingered in the air, a poison cloud that only Diaz could perceive, but that all of them felt. They continued moving deeper into the dark, their caution now laced with an accelerating sense of dread. The silence had returned in pockets, only to be broken by the grating sounds of their own movements. Every step was a commitment to the terror that lay ahead, a terror that now had a smell. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining above, forming a heavy canopy that blocked the little starlight that remained. The air became heavier, a physical weight that pressed down on their lungs, making each breath shallow and difficult. The ground grew uneven and treacherous, filled with the hidden holes and dips that spoke of long-ago explosions and buried rubble. They were walking over a battlefield, a forgotten history that was now beginning to whisper its secrets. The visual world remained an artificial green dream, seen through the restrictive lenses of their scopes, but the olfactory world was becoming brutally real. The smell Diaz reported was subtle, coming and going on the faint movement of the cold wind, a promise of carnage that lay just ahead, a promise that defied the rules of nature and training. The smell had begun as a faint suspicion, but within 50 meters, it became an inescapable reality. It was no longer a hint of wet dog or old meat. It was an overwhelming stench of decay and fresh blood, a thick, noxious cloud that settled low in the damp air and clung to the back of their throats. Private Reyes gagged, quietly forcing himself to breathe shallowly through his mouth. The forest felt actively hostile now, its silence replaced by the crushing presence of the foul odor. This was not the smell of natural decomposition. This was the smell of violence and recent carnage. Sergeant Miller motioned them to halt, holding his breath. He activated the small tactical light on his rifle, switching it to its lowest, dullest setting. Even this small intrusion of white light felt like a beacon in the oppressive darkness. The weak beam cut through the gloom, revealing a small clearing ahead, a low bowl of ground where the dirt was churned and matted. There it was, the source of the horrific scent. Lying in the center of the clearing were the remains of two dear small European species that should be fleet and invisible in these woods. But these were no longer animals. They were wreckage. Miller crouched low, scanning the area. The deer were horribly mutilated. Their throats were torn out with brutal efficiency, and two of the carcasses had large portions of their entrails and hindquarters consumed. This was immediately and profoundly wrong. Miller had experience with wild boars known for their nastiness. Boars would root and scavenge, but their attacks were messy and frantic. This was precise. He had seen the work of wolves in Alaska, and they followed a typical pattern, winding their prey down, waiting for shock or blood loss, before feeding on the internal organs while the animal was still alive. These deer were simply annihilated. The neck injuries suggested the animals were killed outright before being consumed. Whatever had done this possessed enormous power and a terrifying kind of single-mindedness. It was the work of something that needed only a single moment of contact to destroy. Specialist Diaz moved closer, holding a handkerchief over his mouth and nose, the stench overwhelming even through the thin cloth. He pointed his dull light beam at the raw, torn flesh. It is copper, Miller. It is the blood that is wrong. It smells too rich, too thick, almost like old iron. The metallic odor of fresh venous blood, mixed with the sick sweetness of decay, created a unique terror in the air. The smell was the confirmation. This was not a natural occurrence. The sheer viciousness of the wounds suggested a predator of terrifying strength, one that hunted not just for survival, but with malice. Corporal Hayes, the tracking expert, moved slowly around the edges of the kill zone. His movements were fluid and practiced, his eyes sweeping the disturbed dirt. He was looking for signs of entry and exit clues that would identify the killer. The deer had not put up a protracted fight. There was little sign of scuffle, only the impact of the final brutal attack. Hayes focused his attention on the mud, near the thick tree roots where the earth was soft and yielding. He stopped, his posture freezing. He knelt, sinking one knee into the cold, damp earth, and extended a gloved hand to illuminate the ground with his own small, focused light. The beam settled on a single perfect impression in the mud, a print unlike any they had discussed or trained for. He spoke in a low, steady voice, a counterpoint to the horror of the scene. "Sergeant Miller, come look at this." Miller crawled over, joining Hayes in the mud. The print was enormous. It was a foot shape, but exaggerated and wrong. It was far larger than any military boot a wide, massive depression in the soil. Hayes placed his own size 10.5 boot next to it for comparison. The creature's print ran from the tip of his toes to past the middle of his heel. Its width was unbelievable, fully a half-inch wider on both sides than the specialist's boot. Hayes ran a gloved finger lightly around the edges of the impression. It is not human, Miller. Not even close. It is best described as if you took a wolf's footprint and then stretched it widthwise until it was the size of a coffee can. The toes are elongated and powerful. And look here. He pointed to faint but distinct scoring marks near the tips of the toes. Distinct nail marks. Long, powerful claws. The sight of the print shattered the last illusion of safety. They were facing a creature that walked upright, or semi-upright, a monstrous thing with a human-like foot structure, but with the size and predatory weapons of a terrible beast. It was a physical confirmation of the pale shadow Reyes had seen, and the impossible smell Diaz had reported. This was the entity of the local warnings, the powerful predator that could clear a 9-foot fence and tear 3 animals limb from limb. Miller felt the cold dread sink into his bones, a physical infiltration of fear. They were soldiers trained to face men, not monsters. Their light weapons and peacetime protocols were utterly useless against a creature that left a trail like this. The forest was actively demonstrating its hostility, its ancient power visible in the carnage and the terrible print in the mud. The only logical course was a rapid extraction, but the direction of that trail, the path of the beast, led straight back into the black heart of the Grafenwoehr woods. Corporal Hayes traced the outline of the massive track in the mud one last time, his movements meticulous and slow, despite the urgency of the moment. "This is what you get," he murmured to Miller, "a non-native species. Something enormous that walks upright, or mostly upright. The pressure of the print is uneven. It is like an exaggerated limb, too long, too wide, and the heel strike is all wrong for a powerful predator. It is almost like it is trying and failing to mimic something human. It is not designed to run, it is designed to terrorize." Miller did not need to see the anatomical analysis to understand the terror. The beast that had left this track was stronger than a bear, faster than a wolf, and smarter than any animal he had encountered. He knew they could not stay here exposed in the open clearing, with the mutilated remains of the deer as bait. He gave the order to Mai. Retreat was not an option. They had to seek immediate temporary shelter while they figured out the next move. Their objective was a crumbled old concrete bunker, a remnant of the base's earliest history tucked into a low rise, a scant 300 meters away. They moved quickly, silently, Reyes keeping his thermal scope trained on the tree line, where he had seen the pale flicker. Every shadow was a threat, every gust of wind a potential charge. The bunker was a half-buried tomb of damp, rough concrete. It was cold with a penetrating chill that went straight through their thick uniforms and into the bone marrow. The smell inside was worse than the air outside, a thick mixture of mold, stale urine, and the metallic tang of rust. Claustrophobia settled in, immediately a secondary enemy that worked on the mind. The structure offered protection from bullets, but it was also a perfect trap, a cold cement box with only one way in and one way out. The 4 men huddled inside, their backs pressed against the rough texture of the cold wall. Specialist Diaz wiped the moisture from the inner lens of his night vision goggles, a futile gesture against the perpetual dampness of the concrete. Miller pulled the radio handset close to his mouth. This was the moment to report the confirmed finding, the evidence of the dead deer and the impossible track. This was the moment for the military apparatus to react. Miller repeated the call sign, Raptor One, to command multiple times, his voice low and controlled. He waited for the crisp return of a human voice, a reassurance of external reality. But the radio offered only static, Not the gentle hiss of background noise, but a furious crackling, a harsh sound of electronic interference that seemed to consume his report. He tried again, speaking louder, more urgently, describing the location and the critical nature of the sighting. The only response was a new sound that layered itself over the static. It was clipped. It was unintelligible. It sounded like voices, but they were warped and fragmented, distorted into clipped whispers and metallic clicks that held no meaning. It was not a communication breakdown. It felt like a hostile jamming. They were not only isolated, they were intentionally severed. Miller slowly lowered the handset. His face, in the green light of the night vision, was a mask of cold resignation. The Cold War protocols, the peacetime restrictions, the rules about no live ammunition, they all seemed like a joke, now a set of meaningless guidelines for a war that did not prepare them for a creature that walked the earth outside the known scope of natural law. He whispered to the three men that they were on their own. The communication failure was a final terrifying confirmation of their predicament. They were trapped in a dark forest, inside a cold concrete shell, with no friendly voice and no armed support. The cold, rough concrete pressing against their backs felt less like a sanctuary and more like the inside of a coffin. Reyes moved to the small observation slit, a thin horizontal opening that offered a view of the immediate exterior. The oppressive weight of the forest pressed in a solid curtain of black and green. The silence returned, not the vacuum from before, but a purposeful silence, one that listened and waited. They had been in the bunker for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of absolute stillness, save for the heavy sound of their own fear-filled breathing. Then it came. A sound that was neither a footfall nor a howl. It was a low scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the damp earth outside. The sound was irregular, dragging and catching, then dragging again. It was slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the bunker. The sound suggested immense weight, coupled with a painful or awkward posture, a limb that did not bend correctly, or a body too long for the ground. Hayes leaned in close to Miller, his voice barely audible. "It is the crawler, Miller. It is dragging itself. It knows we are in here." The sound stopped directly outside the entrance, a sudden and complete cessation of movement. The only thing left was the deafening silence and the knowledge that the creature was on the other side of the cold concrete, a massive waiting presence. The sound of the dragging had stopped abruptly, leaving behind a terrifying vacuum of silence. The four men in the bunker were frozen, their breathing shallow and painfully loud in the cold cement space. They did not move for what felt like hours, a timeless stretch of agonizing stillness where the only movement was the internal tremor of their fear. Every muscle was locked, every sense strained to the breaking point. The oppressive dread was so thick it was almost suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Reyes was pressed against the narrow firing slit, his eye glued to the green-tinted world outside. The view was severely limited, a thin slice of the moonless night. He knew the creature was out there, a massive silent presence mere 3 feet from their position. He could feel its proximity in the chill of the air, in the faint lingering scent of raw meat that seeped in through the tiny crack. The silence was the most potent weapon. It was active, not passive. It was the absolute patience of a predator that knew its prey was trapped. Reyes waited until his vision blurred from the strain, forcing himself to blink and refocus. He told himself to look for movement, only for the subtle shift in the shadows. But the creature did not move the way an animal should move. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light shifted. Reyes realized the creature had begun to move again, but not by walking or running. It was sliding inch by agonizing inch, using the dense shadows of the overgrown vines that clung to the bunker's rough exterior. It was a movement, that defied the physics of its apparent mass. A soundless, terrifying glide. The first part of the creature to enter his limited view was a limb. It was impossibly long, almost exaggerated in its length. The limb was spindly and pale, a frightening white in the green light, and it stretched out to feel the surface of the concrete. It was not a paw or a hand. It was a jointed appendage of bone and tendon that moved with an awkward, deliberate slowness. Then the rest of the form began to resolve itself in the sliver of vision. It was pale and gaunt, too skinny for its sheer height. The creature was hunched over, attempting to stand upright, but failing to maintain a natural posture. Its head was small, disproportionate to the bulk of its stretched torso. Its torso seemed almost translucent, a sickening sight, even filtered through the night vision. The outline was a perfect terror, the horrifying shape of something trying and failing to mimic being human. It was the pale crawler come to gruesome life, a monstrosity of bone and starved muscle. Sergeant Miller saw the subtle tensing of Reyes's shoulder muscles and knew contact had been made. He did not ask for a report. He simply whispered a single word to the squad. Silence. Absolute silence. Every man in the bunker understood the implied order. The creature was searching. It was sniffing the air, studying the bunker. Any noise, any indication of their fear, would be an invitation. The pale creature paused directly in front of the bunker entrance, the place where the shadows were deepest and the concrete was most crumbled. Reyes felt a wave of dizzying nausea hit him. He was looking at something that should not exist in the framework of their organized world, something of pure nightmare. Its head tilted slowly, studying the air above the entrance. It was listening for the sounds of foul fear. The creature's movements were agonizingly slow and deliberate, confirming Miller's earlier realization that this was an intelligent entity engaged in a terrifying game of seeking. Its long, stretched neck craned downward toward the entrance gap. It was not breathing the way a human or an animal would. It seemed to draw the air into its body in short, sharp intakes, almost like a snake or an insect. Then the motion stopped entirely. The creature was motionless, a frozen column of terrifying white bone and a muscle. The silence reached its unbearable peak. Reyes watched the terrifying stillness. He could not tell if the creature was looking at him through the slit or simply past him. The tension was an electric current, a palpable force that filled the small space. Then the silence was violently ruptured. It was not a roar or a simple animal cry. It was a deep guttural sound that erupted from the creature's chest, a sound that resonated with pure, ancient malice. It was a growl of immense power, terrifying in its depth. But the most horrifying aspect was that the sound was unnervingly complex. It sounded part human, but distorted and wrong, a terrifying blend of man and a beast. It was a noise that suggested intelligence and savage intent. The growl was a deliberate act meant to terrorize, meant to draw out the prey. The very air inside the bunker seemed to compress under the weight of that sound. The sound of the guttural growl had been the final, definitive confirmation. It vibrated through the rough concrete walls of the bunker, a deep physical tremor that settled in the chest of every man inside. It was a sound of a pure malice, of violence that transcended the natural world, and confirmed their most terrifying suspicions. Sergeant Miller felt the shock run through him like a physical blow. He knew instantly that this was not a member of the opposing team playing a part in the exercise. This thing was clearly some kind of animal, or God knows what. The growl was cut short as abruptly as it began. Reyes, still pressed against the slit, watched as the pale form executed a sudden, impossible motion. Without warning, this thing just turned and bolted into the woods. It moved fast, like inhumanly fast. Within seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The speed was unnatural, a terrifying blur that left no time for reaction, or thought. The forest seemed to inhale the creature back into its depths, restoring the profound silence that had preceded the attack. The four men remained frozen for another minute, waiting for a follow-up attack, a final charge. When the silence held, Miller slowly exhaled a breath. He realized he had been holding since the dragging began. The element of surprise was gone. The creature knew they were here. The small concrete space felt less like a safe haven and more like a target painted on the ground. "We pull out now," Miller whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "We head for the nearest perimeter road. We do not stop. We move as fast as possible." The men scrambled to their feet, the shock of the encounter slowing their movements. Specialist Dias felt the sudden metallic taste of fear and adrenaline on his tongue, the same coppery taste he associated with blood and danger. They had all heard it, and they had all seen it. There was no room for doubt, no space for rationalization. The childhood nightmares had suddenly become very real. Reyes checked his scope one last time, scanning the dark expanse where the creature had vanished. He found only the cold, empty green of the trees. He turned and followed Miller out of the bunker and back into the exposed danger of the night air. The air was heavy with the lingering echo of the growl, a residual sound that seemed to vibrate in the very fibers of the leaves and the earth. They moved quickly and quietly around the bunker, toward the direction of the main access road, their boots pounding through the underbrush as they pushed deeper and deeper into the woods. Miller was running on instinct, focused entirely on putting distance between them and the site of the encounter. Corporal Hayes, the tracker, lagged behind by a few meters, his eyes sweeping the ground around the entrance of the bunker. He was searching for any final piece of evidence, a sign that the creature had rested or left something behind. He stopped where the creature had paused just before the growl. He dropped to one knee, shining his tactical light toward the damp earth. He found it. It was not a footprint this time, but a long, ragged trail, scored into the dirt, a depression where the creature's immense weight had dragged itself across the ground. The trail was deep and wide, a continuous groove that ran for several feet before being lost beneath the roots of a nearby fir tree. It was the physical confirmation of the scraping sound they had heard, the noise that had preceded the violent confrontation. The trail was consistent with the creature's unnatural, awkward posture, its exaggerated limbs failing to fully support its bulk in a standard walk. It was the sign of something immense and powerful, but something that was forced to drag its weight when attempting to move silently. Hayes paused, tracing the depth of the groove with the tip of his knife. The earth was soft here, but the drag mark was deep enough to suggest a massive body mass, several times that of any wolf or large contiguous. The scraping was jagged, raw, like the creature's claws, or perhaps a jutting bone had caught the soil. He quickly caught up to the others and pulled Miller's sleeve urgently. "Miller, stop!" he commanded, his voice barely a breath. "Look!" He pointed back toward the bunker. Miller turned and saw the faint but undeniable trail in the beam of Hayes's light. It was the final, terrifying detail, a gruesome confirmation of the creature's reality and its power. Hayes spoke the terrifying truth. It was dragging itself, but then it stood up to look in the slit. "It is massive, Miller. We were not dealing with a dog. We were dealing with something that is too basic to be real." They did not need to be told twice. The sight of the trail, combined with the memory of the growl and the impossible speed, pushed them into a renewed, frantic flight. The knowledge that the creature knew their exact location and was currently resting or hunting somewhere in the impenetrable darkness ahead fueled their legs. They pulled out of there as fast as they possibly could. The forest was no longer a training ground. It was the territory of a monster. The terror that gripped them after the growl was a physical thing, a burning urgency that made their muscles ache and their lungs burn. They were running blind in the dark, driven only by the primal need to escape the territory of the thing they had seen. Private Reyes was the most vocal, though his words were only internal demands. They needed to report this. They had witnessed something impossible, something that violated every rule of biology and physics. He argued silently with himself about what the creature could be. Was it a local monster born of the ancient German folklore they had heard whispered about? Or was it something darker, something created by the very militaries that were supposed to be guarding this area, a botched bio-experiment gone feral? Either way, the only way to survive was to get out and expose the truth to command. Sergeant Miller, however, was focused only on distance and survival. He knew the radio was useless, the whispers and static confirming their complete isolation. He made the immediate tactical decision to bypass the official surveillance objective and focus entirely on extraction. The mission was dead. The priority was getting the 4 men and the knowledge of the creature back to the nearest known outposts, which lay far to the southwest. They began a frantic movement, a difficult high-speed, low-visibility run through the dense underbrush. The terrain was uneven, a mixture of slick mud, loose gravel, and thick patches of thorny scrub. The movement was a violent assault on their bodies, a continuous succession of stumbles and sharp pains. The heavy weight of their packs and rifles became a cruel burden, amplifying their exhaustion. The sensory focus shifted entirely to touch the painful reality of their exposed skin and stressed muscles. Branches whipped against their faces, leaving stinging welts. Thorny vines caught at their uniforms, tearing the thick fabric. The instability of the uneven ground under their heavy boots was a constant threat of twisted ankles and broken bones. They were in open terrain, and every tree that rushed past, every exposed patch of open ground, made them feel dangerously vulnerable. The feeling of being hunted in the dark was almost as unbearable as the sight of the monster itself. Miller used his compass and the faint wash of starlight visible through the high canopy to guide them. Their night vision scopes were only partially helpful. They showed the immediate path, but their narrow focus made them lose perspective of the wider, disorienting woods. The green-tinted world rushed by in a blur of trunks and shadows, a tunnel of exhausting effort. Their pace was unsustainable. After what Miller estimated was over half an hour of continuous, punishing flight, they were deep into the stage of pure fatigue, their legs heavy, their movements sloppy. They slowed to a stumbling walk, pausing briefly to catch their breath. The air they dragged into their lungs was cold and thin, doing little to quell the desperate burn in their chests. It was Corporal Hayes, the tracker, who noticed it first. He had been moving by instinct, relying on landmarks more than his compass readings. Hayes had a finely tuned memory for the specific shapes of trees, the unique patterns of moss growth, the angle of old lightning scars. He stopped, breathing deeply, his head tilted slightly to one side. "Sergeant," he spoke, his voice raspy and choked with exhaustion. "Did we pass a tree that big already?" Miller looked where Hayes pointed, using his low beam light. It was an enormous oak, a tree of grotesque age. Its trunk was wider than the width of a jeep, and its lower branches were twisted and gnarled into impossible forms, like the limbs of a sleeping giant. The bark was split and scarred by some ancient violence. It was a distinctive landmark, the kind of tree you would not forget having passed. They looked at it in silence. A cold wave of confusion washed over the squad, cutting through the haze of their exhaustion. Hayes stated that he was certain they had passed this tree at least once already, perhaps a full hour ago. Miller dismissed it at first, attributing the sense of repetition to the disorientation of running in the dark. They moved past the tree, pushing on for another 10 minutes of strenuous travel, their movements now slow and heavy. Then they came into a small circular clearing, where the underbrush was safe and the tree line was clear and defined. And there it was again. The massive oak. Its girth unmistakable, its scarred bark impossible to ignore. They were circling. They were caught in a loop. The realization was a profound psychological shock that shattered their tactical focus. The woods were not just challenging. The woods were actively working against them. They had not been running away from the creature. They had been running in place, a desperate exercise in futility. They were trapped inside a boundary they could not perceive, a psychological barrier placed there by the forest itself. The exhaustion was now coupled with a debilitating sense of confusion and despair. They were isolated, their radio was dead, and now the laws of navigation had ceased to function. The sheer terror of the predator was replaced by the existential dread of being hopelessly lost in a place that refused to let them leave. The sight of the colossal scarred oak, for the third time in under an hour, was a blow, not to their bodies, but to their sanity. The terrifying realization that they were caught in a perpetual loop shattered the last remnants of their composure. They were seasoned soldiers trained to conquer terrain and escape ambushes, but they were utterly defenseless against impossible geometry. Sergeant Miller felt a cold fury mixed with profound helplessness. He fought the urge to rush forward, to simply break through the invisible boundary by sheer will. He knew that panic was the final enemy. He ordered them to halt directly beneath the oppressive canopy of the massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching down like the talons of a hawk. The psychological distress was immediate and deep. Private Reyes began shaking uncontrollably, a reaction not to the cold, but to the shame of being lost in a tiny circle. Corporal Hayes, the tracking expert, checked his compass for the 10th time. Every reading was consistent. Every reading pointed them away from the tree and toward extraction. Yet every movement brought them back to the same spot. He looked up at the few visible stars, their positions fixed and true. His calculations for dead reckoning were sound. The failure was not in his instruments or his skill. The failure was in the space itself. The rules of travel, the axioms of geometry simply did not apply here. The forest itself appeared to be alive, an entity that possessed an awareness of their presence and a malevolent will to keep them imprisoned. This was existential dread, the horrifying realization that their physical environment was actively working against them. The trees did not just stand silent. They watched. The ground did not just absorb their footsteps. It waited for them to repeat their failed path. Specialist Diaz articulated the feeling that bound them, a terror that went beyond the visual repetition. "It feels like a strong headwind, Miller," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "We are walking into something that pushes us back. It only pushes us, though. There is no wind in the trees. The air is dead quiet. It is like the space itself is saying no." The description resonated with all of them. They had all felt the increased resistance in their stride, the subtle physical effort required to move forward that was disproportionate to the terrain. It was an unseen current that carried them back against their will, back to the monumental oak that served as their silent prison warden. The sensation was terrifying because it could not be fought. They could not shoot at an invisible current or ambush a force field. They spent another 20 minutes attempting to break the loop, Miller sending them on a zigzag pattern, Hayes trying to use a specific bearing based on the position of the North Star. Every attempt ended the same way. The air grew heavier, the resistance increased, and within moments, the massive outline of the scarred oak loomed before them. The unchanging visual landscape became a terrifying constant, a hypnotic nightmare seen over and over again through the green filter of their scopes. The monotony of the horror began to wear them down, replacing panic with a cold, weary despair. They collapsed near the base of the oak, their breathing ragged, their exhaustion total. Miller felt the rough, cold bark of the tree against his back. They had been reduced to the role of caged animals, pacing the same small circle, under the indifferent gaze of an ancient, hostile intelligence. Reyes lifted his head, resting his chin on his rifle barrel. His eyes swept the lower branches of the oak, looking for anything that might explain the perpetual loop. It was not until he focused on a low trailing branch that he saw it. It was not a bird's nest or a cluster of moss. It was a small piece of cloth hanging from a low, thick limb. It was old, profoundly old. The fabric was tattered and thin, bleached to a pale, nondescript color that only just registered in the green light. It was tied with a dried, brittle knot, an ancient binding that had resisted the wind and the rain for an unknowable length of time. It was clearly not a military marker or a trail marker used by hikers. It was something ritualistic, something placed with intention by local hands, perhaps generations ago. It suggested a passage, a warning, or a deliberate demarcation of the territory they were now trapped inside. The cloth was a physical hint of the external world, of people who knew the rules of this terrifying space. They were not alone in knowing the secret of this wood. Others had marked the boundary before them. The discovery of the marker offered a small crack of hope, a possibility of understanding the impossible geometry of their prison. The small tattered piece of cloth, hanging from the gnarled oak, was a lifeline of terrifying hope. Private Reyes reached out and touched it, his fingertips registering the extreme dryness, the brittle texture of the ancient fibers. It felt like something pulled from a long-forgotten grave. It was a tangible link to a history that superseded the war games and the training protocols of the 1980s. Corporal Hayes meticulously examined the knot, a complex dried binding that was clearly not standard Army issue. He declared it to be incredibly old, perhaps dating back many generations. It was a clear superstitious warning, or marker, a deliberate demarcation created by the local populace who understood the true nature of this terrifying woods. The forest was not merely haunted. It was actively managed by ancient fear. Sergeant Miller made the tactical call. Military intelligence had failed them. The radio was dead. Their maps were useless in the face of impossible geometry. Their only chance lay in following the local knowledge that had resisted the test of time. They spread out, moving slowly and silently away from the gigantic oak, searching for a second sign. Within 10 minutes, Specialist Diaz found it, a second piece of pale, brittle fabric tied to a low-standing pine. It was almost invisible, consumed by the moss and shadows, but it was there. The marker was positioned at an exact angle from the first one, leading them not toward the extraction point they desired, but deeper into the heart of the restricted area. They continued their somber trek, finding a third, and then a fourth marker, all equally old and deliberately placed. Hayes realized they were following a forgotten perimeter line, a trail of ritualistic warnings that the local people had established to navigate, or perhaps contain the darkness of this sector. The path they were on felt wrong, leading them toward an older, darker concentration of trees where the canopy was so thick it seemed to swallow the light. This was a place that felt undisturbed by the noise of the modern world, a pocket of deep antiquity, where the air hung heavy with the disturbing quiet of history. The fear changed its texture. It was no longer the sudden shock of confrontation, but the slow, sinking dread of approaching the source of the evil. They were walking into a place of ritual and fear, of things that existed long before the U.S. Army established its first outpost on German soil. The silence here was different from the silence of their initial deployment. It was a silence that felt expectant, a massive held breath that waited for their final arrival. The knowledge that they were moving by the guidance of folklore rather than intelligence reports lent an air of ritual sacrifice to their movements. Miller felt the profound shift in atmosphere. The trees were older, more gnarled, their bark rougher and harder against his touch. The ground was littered with broken stone and fragments of forgotten history. Every step was a step back in time, into a territory where the rules of man had surrendered to the power of myth. After perhaps 20 minutes of following the nearly invisible path, the ancient markers abruptly stopped. They found themselves at the edge of a small clearing, where the density of the forest broke for a moment. They halted, pressing themselves against the cold, damp bark of the boundary trees, their eyes scanning the opening. The clearing was small and unsettling. In the center, the earth was a mass of disturbed rocky ground, but their attention was immediately drawn to a single site on the far side of the clearing. There was a faint flickering light. It was a small, persistent glow, low to the ground, and partially obscured by a crumbling stone structure. It was not the harsh white light of a generator or a battery-powered lamp. It was warm and unsteady, a slow, hypnotic pulse of orange light that fought valiantly against the encroaching dark. It was the undeniable sign of human or pseudo-human activity of a controlled flame. The sight of the light triggered a powerful, instantaneous mix of hope and apprehension. Hope because the light meant people who could lead them out, people who could explain the markers and the loop. Apprehension because the light was exactly where the ancient markers had led them, deep into the oldest, darkest part of the haunted woods. It was possible it was a beacon of civilization. It was equally possible it was a lure. Miller raised his hand for absolute silence, the movement slow and deliberate. He focused his night vision on the light, trying to resolve the structure surrounding it. It was too far, and the light was too dim to offer clear detail. It just remained there, flickering steadily, a beacon in the terrifying dark. The only way to know the truth was to move toward it. They had followed the superstitious path to its conclusion. The reward was waiting. The flickering light in the distance was the first promise of salvation they had encountered since the patrol began. They moved toward it, abandoning the subtle path of the ancient cloth markers, their exhaustion giving way to a new surge of desperate hope. The dread did not lift entirely, but it receded enough to allow rational movement, a focused trajectory toward that small, unsteady beacon in the massive darkness. The journey to the light was slow and cautious, every shadow a potential ambush, every snapped twig a false alarm. They moved as a tight unit, Sergeant Miller leading Specialist Diaz and Private Reyes with Corporal Hayes bringing up the rear, his eyes sweeping their back trail. The trees finally began to thin, revealing a small clearing, a flat patch of ground where the air was unnaturally heavy and still. In the center of the clearing stood a tiny rundown hunting cabin, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs and a steeply pitched roof. It was clearly abandoned by the military long ago, left to the slow-consuming process of rot and decay. The windows were opaque with dirt, the door sagging on rusted hinges. The sight of the cabin offered a momentary powerful psychological release. It was shelter. It was man-made. It was a tangible place to rest and reorient away from the terrifying, impossible woods. Miller signaled for them to check the perimeter before approaching the structure. The air around the cabin was stagnant, cold, and heavy. It did not carry the usual scent of forest life or the raw decay of their earlier encounter. It smelled of old dust and dry, crumbling wood, a scent that spoke of deep, undisturbed slumber. They moved quietly to the sheltered side of the cabin, their backs pressed against the rough timber. The light was not coming from inside the cabin. The discovery was a profound disappointment, a final check on their rising hope. The light was coming from beyond the cabin, set back slightly into the tree line, where the darkness was deepest. They moved toward it slowly, their earlier relief hurtling into acute apprehension. The light source was a small stone structure, an ancient relic tucked into a nest of ferns and moss. It was clearly a shrine, a small altar of rough, uncut stone that looked as though it had been assembled by peasant hands many centuries ago. The stone was cold and damp, against their touch scarred by the passage of time and the indifferent weather. It was a place of ritual, not a place of refuge. In the center of the stone altar, protected from the wind by two rough slate slabs, sat a single candle. This was the source of the flickering glow. The flame was small, frail, and highly vulnerable, a tiny orange point fighting against the crushing blackness of the German night. The candle gave off a very faint smell, one that registered only after they had been standing there for several seconds. It was the scent of beeswax and old tallow, the slightly sweet, smoky aroma of a perpetually burning flame. Miller felt the coppery metallic taste of fear receding from his mouth, replaced by the dry, powdery taste of the dust and the sweet perfume of the wax. The sensory focus was a bizarre contradiction. The scent of ritual and fragile warmth in the midst of paralyzing terror. The structure confirmed the folklore warnings. They had stumbled upon the shrine, the very place the locals maintained to keep the ancient entity at bay. Miller looked at the tiny, persistent flame and understood the magnitude of its importance. This was not a comforting presence. This was a precarious barrier. The structure was a prison. The light was the lock. As they approached the altar, the flame seemed to shrink under the scrutiny of their powerful night vision scopes. The tiny point of light danced violently, casting erratic shadows that lunged and retreated across the moss-covered stone. It was barely alive, flickering precariously against the cold, still air that surrounded the cabin. It was an eternal flame, but one that was dangerously close to being extinguished. Miller saw the faint sheen of sweat on Specialist Diaz's face in the green glow. The relief of finding shelter was instantly replaced by a deep and profound dread. The candle was their only protection, and it was failing. Its light was a final warning, a flickering sign of vulnerability that drew their entire mission into a new, terrifying face-to-face, one defined not by military objectives, but by the desperate need to keep that tiny flame from dying out. The sight of the small flickering candle at the center of the stone altar brought a chilling moment of clarity to Sergeant Miller. He remembered the briefings, the laminated sheets of cultural warnings posted near the entry gate. The legend was clear. The shrine had been placed there long ago, as a way to ward off a vengeful spirit. So long as the eternal flame at its center kept burning, the beast would be kept at bay. Now the only problem was that the eternal flame was dying. It was a single tiny point of orange life, fighting a losing battle against the cold blackness. Miller understood the profound vulnerability of their position. This tiny wick, this small pool of melted wax, was their only defense against the thing that had left the enormous track and roared with the sound of malice. Private Reyes cautiously approached the shrine, his movements slow and deliberate. He cupped his gloved hands around the tiny flame, attempting to shield it from the imperceptible movement of air. He felt the faint warmth of the candle against the biting cold of the night air, a fragile, hopeful heat that was immediately swallowed by the surrounding chill. His hand trembled slightly, the physical manifestation of his fear, and the flame dipped dangerously close to the wax pool, the terrifying moment where their protection almost ceased to exist. He pulled back, fearing his own breath might snuff out the light completely. The squad stared at the candle, the silent, desperate focus of their entire predicament. Corporal Hayes spoke quietly, his voice thick with the desperation of their isolation. "We cannot stay here, Miller. We cannot fight this thing with blanks, and we cannot guard a candle for a week. We need to know the rules of engagement." Miller agreed. Their conventional training was useless. The creature defied their understanding of combat, and the woods defied their maps. They needed knowledge, a history that the military had dismissed as mere superstition. The only way to get that knowledge was to leave the confines of the training area and seek out the local people, the ones who understood the folklore, who had kept this tiny, crucial flame burning for generations. They had to go where the rules of the American Army did not apply. The decision was a terrifying breach of protocol. Leaving the training area without authorization was grounds for severe disciplinary action if they were caught. But the alternative was certain death by the unnatural thing that waited for the candle to fail. The UO decided to risk the human punishment rather than face the mythological predator. They gathered their meager gear, their movements now imbued with a quiet determination, coupled with extreme caution. They were shifting the battlefield from the tactical to the historical. They would seek answers in a local town, a place of warm lights and human voices. They would ask about the curse, the monster, and the meaning of the shrine. Miller reminded them to switch off all military identifiers on their gear, to move as inconspicuous hikers or tourists if they encountered any. Was one. The transition from soldier to civilian spy was jarring, but necessary. They moved away from the stone altar, leaving the vulnerable flame to its solitary battle against the dark. The tiny point of light seemed to grow fainter as they walked away, receding into the oppressive blackness of the trees. They followed the small deer trail they had used to approach the shrine, which led to a wider, rough road used primarily by park maintenance vehicles, or perhaps the local forest master. It was Specialist Diaz who noticed it first. He was scanning the dirt road not for footprints, but for any sign that they were being tracked. He stopped his low beam light, settling on a specific patch of damp earth near a cluster of jagged rocks. There was a faint but distinct track. It was not the enormous clawed print of the creature. This was a tire track. It was thin and deeply grooved, the unmistakable pattern of a very old vehicle, one that had passed through the area recently, but not too recently. It was a sign of civilization, a proof of human transit. The track was heading away from the shrine and toward the training boundary. The locals were not just aware of this place, they actively visited it. The tire track was a fragile thread, leading them toward the human world and the knowledge they desperately needed. The old tire track on the rough dirt road was a guiding thread of reality, pulling the squad out of the woods and away from the terrifying trap of the perpetual loop. They moved quickly and silently, following the faint indentation in the damp earth, the sense of urgency overriding their deep exhaustion. The memory of the flickering candle and the chilling growl spurred their legs. They pushed onward for nearly an hour, until the dense curtain of the trees finally began to thin. Sergeant Miller, the patrol leader, spotted the perimeter marker, a low wire fence designed only to delineate properties, not to contain any serious threat. They crossed the boundary one by one, stepping out of the official military jurisdiction and onto the sovereign land of the local community. The moment they crossed the line, the atmosphere shifted with jarring speed. The profound silence of the restricted zone was replaced by the low rhythmic drone of distant humanity. It was the familiar sound of highway traffic, the constant wash of vehicles moving at high speed on the nearby Autobahn. This sound was a bizarre moment of relief. It was the noise of the world operating normally, oblivious to the ancient terror that resided in the woods just meters away. It was the sound of life and organized society, of powerful psychological counterpoint to the savage case they had just eniggered. Miller gave the order to prepare for entry into the nearest village. They had to assume the civilian populace possessed the essential knowledge needed to fight, or at least survive the creature. They found a secluded thicket of dense pines, an area of sharp rocks and difficult terrain, where they cached their heavy military equipment. They wrapped their M16 rifles and specialized scopes in heavy plastic sheeting, burying them shallowly beneath layers of pine needles and damp earth. The cold metal of the rifles felt inadequate, useless against the supernatural threat, but leaving them behind was an act of tactical necessity. They stripped off their dusty, sweat-soaked field jackets and pulled out the plain civilian clothing they had brought for occasional off-base travel. The act of changing their clothes was a strange psychological disguise. They traded the camouflage of war for the anonymity of tourism. The heavy protective layers of military life were replaced by thin jeans and simple shirts, which only served to emphasize their vulnerability. They were now exposed no longer soldiers, but simply men alone in a hostile foreign land. Private Reyes felt a profound disorientation, a strange feeling of nakedness without the weight of his gear. He kept his small tactical knife hidden and checked his pockets for the local currency, the few things that could buy them answers. Specialist Diaz walked with the stiffness of a man trying to repress his professional identity, attempting to appear relaxed and civilian, while every nerve ending was screaming a military alert. They walked down the rough road for another kilometer until the first lights of the village became visible. The town was small, its shape defined by the steep roofs and dark timber of traditional German architecture. It should have felt comforting, a safe haven of warmth and activity. But as they approached, the quiet deepened. The familiar drone of the Autobahn traffic was muted here by the winding hills and the thick stone walls. They entered the main street. The houses were tall and dark, their windows illuminated by interior lights that were kept deliberately low. The lighting in the streets was sparse and dim, a series of single yellow lamps casting pools of weak light at long intervals. The entire village seemed to be operating under a heavy shroud, a self-imposed darkness. The most unnerving fact was the complete absence of people. It was barely 9 o'clock in the evening, but the streets were utterly empty. There were no cars moving, no children playing, no figures walking dogs. There were no stirring lights in the local taverns or the small bakery windows. The village was completely silent and deserted. The contrast between the hoped-for bustle of human life and the profound, self-imposed darkness of the town was deeply eerie. The locals knew something. They were not out on the streets because they had learned the necessary rhythm of survival here. They kept their distance from the woods, and they stayed indoors after dark. The village was not a safe haven. It was a place of collective, white terror. The squad had fled one darkness, only to realize that the locals lived in another. The eerie silence of the small German village was finally broken when they found the local guest house. It was a sturdy timber building that offered a beacon of warm light in the pervasive darkness. They entered the heavy oak door and were immediately enveloped by the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, a comforting primal scent that momentarily suppressed the memory of a deceit and fear they carried from the woods. The hosts, a middle-aged couple, were overly welcoming. They were treated with a suspicious, exaggerated kindness. The hosts seemed to appreciate that the four men were not acting like the typical boisterous Americans they were used to accommodating. Sergeant Miller felt the tension immediately. The kindness was a mask of politeness that barely concealed a profound curiosity, and perhaps an acute apprehension about why four strange men were arriving on foot so late at night. The host ushered them to a quiet table near the back, where they were quickly served warm food and large glasses of the region's strong dark beer. The taste of the beer, the bitter tang of the hops, and the solid warmth of the liquid was a powerful sensory distraction. It was a moment of false safety, a brief reprieve from the exhausting terror of the woods. They ate quickly, silently, their minds racing with the questions they needed to ask. Miller waited until the plates were cleared, and the host returned with a fresh pitcher of beer. He spoke in low, measured tones, asking about the history of the area. He claimed they were amateur historians, looking into the local legends and myths. He specifically asked about the ancient forest that bordered the training area and the small stone shrine that marked the perimeter. The host laughed a dry, hollow sound that did not reach his eyes. He poured Miller another glass of beer and dismissed the questions with a wave of his hand. He said that the legends were fun stories for tourists. He said that historically, the area had its fair share of monsters. He claimed there was nothing to fear now, only old tall tales, and the usual stuff like myths and spooky castles. The local knowledge was being withheld, cloaked in the acceptable guise of folklore and tourist amusement. Miller watched the host closely. The man was too nervous, his laughter too loud for a simple dismissal. Miller decided to press the issue, bypass the myths, and moving directly to the physical evidence. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We were near the old boundary today," he said carefully, choosing his words. "We saw something that was not a ghost or a witch or a goblin. We saw the trail of something very large. We found a track in the mud and the snow. It was a single print." He described the size and the terrifying shape of the impression in the mud. He explained the unnatural width, the exaggerated length, and the deep, distinct nail marks that Corporal Hayes had identified. "It was a massive foot," Miller concluded, "but it was not the foot of a wolf or a human. It was something in between." The change in the host was immediate and prolonged. The false cheerfulness, the wide smile, the forced laughter vanished instantly. The man's face went rigid, the color draining away, leaving his skin pale and stretched in the dim light. He stared into his beer glass, his posture slumping as if the weight of Miller's description had settled on his shoulders. The earlier dismissal was forgotten, replaced by a deep, undeniable terror. He looked up at Miller, his eyes wide with an ancient, weary fear. He spoke now not with the tone of a host amusing a traveler, but with the quiet, desperate sincerity of a man confirming a shared nightmare. The local knowledge was now unlocked by the irrefutable evidence of the physical world. The host grew serious, his expression confirming that the legends were far more than just myths. The atmosphere in the small guest house, which had offered a moment of sensory relief, instantly reverted to a deep, internalized dread. They had finally found the source of the truth and the terror in this quiet German town. The host's face was pale and drawn in the dim lamplight, the fear in his eyes confirming everything Sergeant Miller had suspected. "The print you saw," he said, his voice now low and conspiratorial, a sound barely audible above the low background hum of the old guest house. "That is the proof that the old stories are true. We do not speak of it here, but it is the thing that makes us keep our distance from the woods. It is the reason we do not like to stay out after dark." He looked around the room, as if fearing the sound of his own words would carry beyond the walls of the small tavern. He began to speak slowly, weaving the thread of the ancient legend. "The area used to be comprised of 3 villages, not one city, as it is today. This was around the 14th or 15th century, long before the passage of time could completely distort such records and stories. One summer day, the town was preparing for a great festival, a time of joy since the harvest had been plentiful. The evening festivities were scheduled to start with a great feast, a gathering of all the townspeople and those of the 2 adjacent towns. But toward mid-afternoon, the anticipation was violently broken. A small child wandered into the village covered from head to toe in blood. The villagers rushed to her, recognizing her as being from the nearest village. They tried to help the child, but her injuries were too severe. She did not survive. But before she died from her wounds, she told the horrified villagers of a beast that had massacred her entire home. Enraged and terrified, the townsfolk grabbed their weapons, whatever axes, pitchforks, and tools they could find, and set out immediately to hunt this thing down. On their way, they encountered several farms which had also been attacked. The damage was horrific. Whole herds of cattle were wiped out, their bodies torn and mutilated. The homes themselves were barely standing structures of splintered wood and broken stone. There were the corpses of men that looked as if a pack of wolves had torn them limb from limb. The hunting party proceeded to the second town. The result was exactly the same. The village had been completely wiped out. There was not a single living soul left around. No animals, no people, nothing. Just the smell of blood and torn body parts and an absolute dead silence that filled the air. The silence was the worst part, a massive void where life should have been. The hunting party decided to press on toward the third and furthest village to see if it had miraculously been spared. It had not. At first it seemed like everyone here had also been wiped out, but then they saw movement. The town's main hall was mostly still intact, and there were signs of life coming from inside the structure. The leader of the hunting party called out a challenge, demanding that whatever was inside reveal itself. They were met with an immediate, bone-chilling howl that erupted from within the residence. One of the armed men attempted to storm the hall, trying to slay the creature inside, but he was instantly thrown back through the front door, which then slammed shut with a terrible finality. Terrified by the creature's immense strength and its clear possession of the building, the large group set fire to the structure. They stood around the fire and watched the main hall burn completely to ashes. Nothing and no one ever came out of the burning building. That was the end of the massacre and the terrible reign of the beast. The host finished the tale, his voice reduced to a dry, fearful whisper. He stated that the story was more than just a legend to people in these parts. He said that even to speak about the beast is supposed to bring bad luck. He confirmed that the people around the town do not like going out at night because something about the quiet darkness just does not feel right at times, even for those who grew up here. The host's fear was palpable, a heavy blanket of historical dread that hung in the air of the small tavern. They had the historical narrative now, and it was a terrifying mirror to the creature they had encountered only hours before. The host finished the tale of the burning town hall and the subsequent silence with a quiet, terrified finality. The beast was killed the first time, he said. But to prevent the spirit from lingering, they erected the shrine and placed the candle. That tiny flame is supposed to keep the evil at bay. It is a very old ritual. He then lowered his voice even further, describing the historical figures who added to the modern fear of the werewolf. He told them the story of Thomas Schweitzer, a soldier in the early 1800s who abandoned the army and descended into brutal violence. Schweitzer murdered a family, and the mother, with her dying breath, cursed him, stating that on every night of a full moon, he would change into a rabid wolf. The host said that the legend claims Schweitzer's body twisted and grew into that of a werewolf, driven only by rage and insatiable bloodlust. For many nights, this creature rampaged through the countryside, slaughtering livestock and leaving the mutilated bodies of men and women behind. Schweitzer's reign of terror was finally ended by the villagers who armed themselves and hunted the beast down near the village of Moorbach. They decapitated the body and drove a stake through its heart before burying it and erecting the shrine to contain the vengeful spirit. Corporal Hayes listened intently, the new information hitting his tactical mind with a strange mix of history and confused diffusion. He began to process the incident through the lens of pure logic and analysis, ignoring the supernatural claims. He considered the criminal psychology of it. Hayes reasoned that the idea of serial killers was a concept only studied within the last 100 years or so. In the early 1800s, people could not fathom a human being capable of such heinous, systematic crimes. Hayes suggested quietly to Miller that when the townsfolk came across these brutal scenes splattered with gore and mutilated bodies, they would not rationalize it as the work of a man. They would try to rationalize it as the work of a wild beast and animal, and not a human. Schweitzer might just have been a deranged serial killer in his time, but to make sense of just how evil he was, people depicted him as a beast or a man afflicted by some kind of supernatural evil. Hayes concluded that the werewolf label was possibly applied later to explain the horrific, unnatural nature of the violence. The atmosphere in the small tavern became thick with moral ambiguity. Was the threat they faced a true monster, a spiritual entity contained by a failing candle? Or was it a psychotic, genetically malformed human being, a terrifying byproduct of criminal depravity and ancient superstition? The horror was not lessened by the analysis, only deepened by the unsettling question of its true identity. The psychological horror of a man losing his identity and becoming a monster was a new layer of dread. As they sat there discussing the blurring line between human and beast, specialist Diaz, who had been quietly looking out of the window toward the dark expanse of the Autobahn's tree line, suddenly froze. His body went rigid, his hand clamping down hard on the wooden edge of the table. He saw it. It was a tall, unnaturally hunched shadow, looking at the guest house from the thick curtain of the far tree line. It was too far away to be seen clearly in the dim light of the village, but its silhouette was unmistakable. The massive bulk, the unnatural height and posture that suggested it was standing on its hind legs. It looked like the larger, darker version of the pale crawler they had seen in the bunker, a terrifying shapeshifter that had followed them out of the forest. The creature was observing them, a silent, massive silhouette against the black background of the woods. Specialist Diaz's terrified grip on the table instantly drew Sergeant Miller's attention. Every man in the squad turned to the window, abandoning the beer and the historical dread in favor of the immediate, visceral terror. Diaz pointed a shaking finger at the edge of the far tree line, the boundary between the quiet street and the dark woods of the Autobahn. The hunched shadow was still there. It began to move. It stepped deliberately out from the deep shadows and into the faint, uncertain glow of the distant streetlights. It was a colossal, dark mass, standing on its hind legs, a terrifying silhouette that dwarfed the stunted pines around it. The sight confirmed the creature's status as a formidable shapeshifter, linking the pale, skinny crawler of the forest to this immense bipedal form. The thing was of unnatural height and posture, a monstrous distortion of a man's frame. The creature stood motionless for a moment, observing the guest house. It lifted its elongated head and began sniffing the air, its large, dark ears on top of its head, twitching like a dog's as it caught their scent. It was not a random pass-by. It had tracked them out of the isolation of the training area and into the false comfort of the village. The creature was hunting them, and it knew safer exactly where they were. The paralyzing fear of direct observation settled over the squad. The host, who had been so forcefully conversational minutes before, let out a small, terrified gasp. All traces of his professional courtesy and his practiced calm evaporated instantly. He yelled in a choked whisper for them to get inside right now. He threw himself across the room with a surprising speed and began violently extinguishing every light source in the guest house. He pulled curtains shut with frantic energy and slammed a heavy wooden interior door closed, plunging the entire building into absolute darkness. The host was not simply asking them to hide. He was terrified of being acknowledged by the creature, terrified of being seen and selected as prey. Miller did not question the host's frantic panic. He and the squad had followed the unspoken command, immediately dropping low to the floor near the window line, their bodies tense and ready to fight or flee, but their weapons useless against the massive creature. The darkness inside the guest house was absolute and suffocating of terrified human blackness. They heard the host fumbling with the heavy deadbolts on the front door, securing them in a desperate attempt to fortify the structure. Reyes peered through a tiny crack in the window frame, his eye desperately seeking the colossal shape. The creature remained outside for another minute, its massive bulk a terrifying presence in the night. Then, just as quickly and silently as it had appeared, it turned. The unnatural silhouette faded back into the dark curtain of the woods. The creature had chosen to retreat, not from fear, but from tactical choice. It had confirmed their position and vanished. The silence that followed was heavy with residual terror. The host stayed huddled by the door, breathing in ragged gasps, his body shaking uncontrollably. They had been exposed, and the protection of the civilian world was revealed to be a fragile illusion. The beast was not confined to the training area. It lived and hunted here alongside the villagers. A few minutes later, the silence was shattered again, not by the sound of the creature, but by the aggressive noise of the human world. The air outside the guest house was filled with the sudden loud sound of approaching sirens and military-grade vehicles. It was a different kind of terror, a grinding mechanical sound that signaled the arrival of a coordinated armed response. They heard the screech of tires and the heavy thud of doors slamming shut on the street outside. This was the terrifying proof that the creature was not only real, but that its presence was a known active problem that demanded the immediate attention of heavily armed authority. The local fear was not just superstition, it was policy. The sound of the approaching sirens was the warning that they were about to be caught between the ancient predator and the modern government conspiracy to contain its horror. The sound of the approaching sirens was cut short, replaced by the heavy roar of internal combustion engines and the crunch of tires on the gravel road outside the guest house. The host remained paralyzed by the door, his body a rigid mass of terrified silence. Sergeant Miller and the squad were pressed against the floor near the window line, their eyes trained on the tiny Uthriki in the drawn curtain. The Thray was no longer the supernatural beast, but the uniformed, heavily armed human response to it. The vehicles were unmarked, a column of heavy utility trucks that pulled up and stopped with disciplined precision. Several officers emerged instantly. Miller scanned their appearance through the limited sight of the crack and immediately noted the disturbing details. The officers were carrying automatic rifles and shotguns. Specifically, Miller recognized the long, sleek barrels and composite frames of the G36 automatic rifles. This was odd. These weapons were typically assigned to the German army, not carried by local police forces. Miller instantly understood that this was a different kind of police force, one that operated outside the normal parameters of civilian law enforcement. The officers did not mill about or set up crime scene tape. They deployed instantly, moving in a quiet, coordinated search pattern around the perimeter of the guest house and the tree line where the creature had been seen. Their mannerisms, their posture, the way they moved around the area and through the forest was terrifyingly precise. It was not the posture of police officers, it was the movement of soldiers of a highly trained hunting unit. It was as if they were actually hunting for something dangerous, something that required absolute military discipline. Corporal Hayes whispered his analysis to Miller, his voice low and cold. "They know exactly what they are looking for, Miller. This is not a random patrol. This is a standing procedure for containment. The local authorities are aware of the creature, and they are here to manage the sighting. They are here to make the evidence disappear." The chilling realization settled over the squad. They were caught in the middle of a massive institutional cover-up. The terror of the beast was compounded by the tension of being observed by a heavily armed, secretive government force. They remained silent and motionless, listening to the sounds of the search. The crunch of the officers' boots on the gravel, The low, serious exchange of voices in German. The faint metallic click of weapons being handled and checked. The sounds were controlled and professional, but they signaled extreme danger. The officers patrolled the area for maybe 2 or 3 hours, their search meticulous and methodical. They focused heavily on the area where the creature had paused and then vanished back into the woods near the Autobahn. The squad could only see 3 officers clearly from their vantage point, but the sheer level of organized activity suggested there were many more deployed in the surrounding area. Finally, the officers began to pile back into their vehicles, preparing to leave. But before they departed, they took a final, deliberate action that confirmed Hayes' suspicion of a cover-up. From the window, the squad watched as 2 of the officers scanned the ground near the tree line, the precise spot where the creature had sidurotris on its hind legs. They were looking for tracks. Once they located a specific set of disturbances in the dirt and snow, they began methodically kicking dirt and snow over the tracks covering the evidence of the creature's passage. The gesture was unmistakable. It was a clear attempt to erase the physical reality of the beast from the public record. The officers were not just containing the monster. They were containing the truth. The threat was no longer singular. It was twofold. There was the ancient horror of the woods and the cold, professional determination of the government to keep its existence a secret. The mistrust, the fear of human authority, mingled with the dread of the supernatural predator. The squad knew that if the officers found their stashed military gear, they would not ask questions. They would assume the soldiers were unauthorized witnesses, and they would treat them accordingly. The unmarked police vehicles carrying the heavily armed officers finally pulled away, their sound receding quickly into the distant hum of the Autobahn. The host remained huddled on the floor by the door, breathing raggedly, convinced the attention they had drawn would soon return. He whispered frantically that the soldiers had to leave the village immediately. He insisted that they had drawn unwanted attention from the authorities and from the creature itself. The beast had smelled them here, and the police knew they had seen the truth. Sergeant Miller knew the host was correct. He addressed the squad in a quiet, analytical voice that masked his inner turmoil. The police were not there to help. They were there for containment. Miller explained that the cover-up was routine, designed to protect the personnel reliability program status of American soldiers. He stated that the program was what enabled personnel to work around nuclear resources often found on Air Force bases. To report a supernatural entity, or even a large, unidentifiable predator, would cast a dark cloud over the career of every man who witnessed it. The military would choose the official lie to maintain order and their own clearance over accepting the terrifying reality. The incident at the Han Air Force Base was a historical precedent, a clear indication that command would compel its soldiers to shred the statements and write in the logbook that only a wild animal had caused the damage. The chilling realization settled over the squad. Their own command structure was compromised or complicit, choosing self-preservation over the truth. The danger was now profoundly twofold. They faced the ancient, massive creature that had tracked them out of the forest, and they faced the quiet, professional conspiracy of the authorities, who would eliminate any unauthorized witnesses. Miller gave the order to move. They had to retrieve their stashed gear. They slipped out of the darkened guest house, giving the trembling host a gesture of silent thanks, and headed back toward the edge of the woods where they had buried their equipment. The civilian clothes now felt like a desperate, foolish disguise. When they reached the thicket of pine and rocks, they quickly uncovered their packs and rifles. The cold metal of the M16 assault rifles felt familiar in their hands, a return to the tactile reality of their training. But the weapons felt profoundly inadequate. They were loaded with blanks for the exercise, and even if they had live ammunition, the rifles were designed to fight men, not monsters that jumped 9-foot fence and smelled of ancient death. The cold metal of the barrel pressing against Miller's gloved hand was a palpable reminder of their helplessness. The touch of the equipment was a call to resolution. They were unarmed by protocol, but they possessed knowledge, which was a more dangerous and powerful weapon. They knew the creature existed. They knew the government lied. Miller made a clear, firm decision that cut through the lingering exhaustion and moral ambiguity. We are not safe here. We cannot stay in this village. We are going back to the training area. We will make our way back to the original rendezvous point and try to re-establish radio contact. He emphasized that the radio failure could have been localized static or interference near the bunker. If they could get a clean signal, they could report the full truth of the creature and the cover-up to a higher echelon of command, one that might still adhere to the truth. The secret they possessed was too dangerous to keep. They had to expose the official lie. With their heavy packs and rifles shouldered, they turned their backs on the silent, complicit village and plunged back into the dark uncertainty of the German woods. Their psychological state had hardened from fear to a cold resolve. They were no longer simply running from a monster. They were running toward a dangerous confrontation with both the beast and the bureaucracy. The silent terror of the German forest immediately reclaimed them once they moved back across the unofficial boundary and left the dark, complicit village behind. The brief respite of the guest house, the smell of wood smoke, and the taste of dark beer were replaced by the cutting cold and the pervasive, heavy silence. The familiar oppressive scent of the woods returned the smell of damp earth pine needles and a faint, acrid undertone of old gunpowder and moldering mud, which clung to the low-lying fog. The sensory focus shifted back to survival, the acute awareness that they were once again walking in the territory of a non-human predator. Raptor One moved in a tight tactical formation, retracing their steps toward the boundary of the training area. They traveled parallel to the Autobahn's tree line, the path that the creature had used to follow them into the village. Every soldier kept his head swiveling, his eyes desperately seeking the pale flicker on the thermal scope or the massive dark silhouette they had seen earlier. The psychological atmosphere became thick with the realization that they were willingly re-entering the danger zone. They spoke in quiet, clipped sentences, their discussion revolving around the two forms of the monster they had witnessed. Private Reyes spoke the obvious conclusion. The creature is not one thing, Miller. It cannot be. The pale crawler we saw in the bunker was too thin, too gaunt with its long, exaggerated limbs. The thing in the village was a colossal dark mass standing fully upright on its hind legs. It is a shapeshifter, Miller. Corporal Hayes agreed, noting that German folklore in particular is full of legends about shape-shifting entities. He reasoned that this ability could explain the terrifying difference between the creature that had dragged itself silently across the dirt and the monstrous, powerfully built figure that stood sniffing the air near the village. The creature could assume the form of a man or various animals, making it an impossible target to classify or to fight. Sergeant Miller accepted the terrifying premise. The knowledge did not provide comfort, but it provided clarity. They were facing an intelligent entity capable of assuming different aspects of terror. This was not merely an animal. This was a supernatural entity, one that played on both the physical fear of a massive beast and the psychological horror of a humanoid distortion. The shape-shifting capability explained the entire incident and linked the pale crawler to the infamous werewolf of the local legends. The conversation solidified their resolve, but amplified the dread. They were walking back toward a rendezvous point that was within the creature's known hunting radius. The silence of the forest was no longer just empty. It was filled with the potential of endless, unseen transformation. Every shadow, every shift in the green light of the scopes could be the monster preparing to assume a new, horrifying form. After another hour of strenuous, silent movement, they finally located the perimeter fence of the training area. It was a 9-foot chain-link barrier, topped with 3 rows of taut barbed wire, a formidable obstacle designed to keep people out and equipment safe inside. It was supposed to represent the final boundary between the unpredictable German woods and the ordered reality of the American military base. They approached the fence line cautiously, their eyes scanning the ground for the creature's massive prints. The sight of the 9-foot barrier should have provided a moment of reassurance, a physical manifestation of order. But then they saw the damage. A section of the heavy chain-link fence was horribly mangled. It was not cut or lowered. The thick chain-link mesh was torn away from the steel posts and stretched high up the wire, twisted and bent at an impossible angle. The top strands of the barbed wire were also pulled apart, broken and dangling like snapped threads. The damage was not caused by human tools or by a vehicle impact. The force required to mangle the 9-foot fence and stretch it upward was immense, suggesting a massive body had simply cleared it with terrifying ease. The sight was the irrefutable, chilling confirmation they did not want. The beast had not just entered the woods or stayed on the boundaries. It had breached the security of the military base itself. The creature was inside the perimeter. The sight of the mangled chain link was a monument to the creature's terrifying strength. The 9-foot fence, designed to be a final boundary, was utterly defeated. Sergeant Miller and the squad approached the torn section, cautiously, their boots crunching on the frozen earth. This was physical, irrefutable evidence that the beast was not merely lurking in the woods. It was inside the base perimeter. Corporal Hayes ran a gloved hand along the sharp, jagged edges of the broken fence wires. The metal was cold and unforgiving against his touch, a visceral reminder of the violation. The wire mesh had been violently peeled back from the steel posts, pulled upward, and twisted like thin ribbon. Hayes confirmed that only a creature of unnatural size and power could have achieved this breach. The violence of the act spoke to a terrifying, single-minded determination. Miller recalled the conversation in the competitor's script, a question asked of the Forestmeister about whether a wolf could jump a 9-foot fence. The answer was a simple, chilling joke. This one could. The damage before them confirmed the grim reality of that statement. The creature they faced operated outside the known limits of the natural world. Hayes then noted a series of deep gouges near the top of the fence post above the twisted wire. These were large, unmistakable claw marks scraped into the hard metal as the beast launched itself over the final section. The physical evidence triggered a spike in the squad's fear, new level of helplessness. Their military base, their sanctuary, their organized reality had been breached with frightening ease. Miller gave the order to move immediately. They were to stay low and out of sight, moving parallel to the fence line toward their rendezvous point. They had to assume the creature was now moving toward the command and security structures, the vital organs of the base. The atmosphere was heavy with dread. The fence was no longer a symbol of protection. It was a symbol of the creature's power. The forest was now quiet again, but the silence was filled with the psychological weight of the monster's unseen presence somewhere ahead of them, within the base. They had been moving for perhaps 10 minutes, hugging the shadows of the tree line, when the sound came. It was distant, but distinct, a terrible sound that pierced the cold air and silenced their anxious breathing. It was the low, unmistakable cry of a dog. It was a bark of confusion, instantly followed by a high-pitched, drawn-out yelp of sheer terror. The sound was cut abruptly short, replaced by an immediate, chilling silence that was heavier and more absolute than the normal silence of the woods. The sound suggested only one thing. The base canine patrol was already on duty. The dog's terrified cry confirmed that the creature had found the working dogs, the one specialized force designed to track and fight large animals. The sudden silence that followed the yelp was the most terrifying sound of all. It meant the fight had ended instantly. It meant the creature had already eliminated the threat. Private Reyes looked at Miller, his eyes wide with fear and despair. The dog was gone. The creature was inside the wire, and it was working its way toward the center of the base, where they knew the soldiers would be caught unaware and unprepared. The haunting silence left by the dog's terrible cry confirmed that they were facing a killing machine that could traverse any obstacle and silence any threat. Their helplessness was total. The immediate chilling silence that followed the dog's terrible cut-short yelp settled over the squad like a shroud of deep water. Sergeant Miller knew instantly what the sound meant. It confirmed the creature's efficiency and its terrifying proximity. He recalled the story of the Moorbach monster, the account from the Air Force veteran who reported that their own canine patrol dog was really spooked and refused to come out of its kennel. The silence they were experiencing now was the final, absolute capitulation of the base's defenses. The canine unit, the one specialized team designed to face this threat, was gone. The realization brought quicker despair. The creature was inside the wire, and it was moving toward the command structures, the center of the base's nervous system. Miller ordered them to move parallel to the perimeter fence, staying in the deep shadows of the tree line, their eyes straining against the limits of their night vision. Their goal was now a desperate race to warn the command before the monster reached the central post. Private Reyes began to shake uncontrollably, a slow internal tremor that was not caused by the cold. He was muttering under his breath about the stupidity of their weapon protocols. He was thinking of the strict rules enforced during peacetime Cold War operations. They carried their M16 weapons with a loaded magazine, but the weapon was unsafe, and crucially there was no round in the chamber. The procedure was designed to prevent accidental discharges and maintain peacetime readiness, but it required an extra second or two to pull the charging handle and chamber around a fatal delay when facing a creature of unnatural speed. Reyes repeated the terrifying fact in his mind. We are unarmed, Miller. Not by having no weapons, but by having weapons that are intentionally crippled. We cannot lock and load, because it is peacetime Cold War. We are going to be killed by a rule, not by an enemy. The quiet desperation was the realization that their own organizational safety rules were now actively betraying them. Their training had prepared them for a slow, tactical threat, but not for a sudden, impossibly fast shapeshifter. The atmosphere was thick with the psychological horror of this institutional betrayal. Every small noise, every crackle of static on the dead radio felt like a judgment on their useless preparedness. They were soldiers rendered helpless by bureaucracy and by their own obedience to a system that did not recognize the monster of the deep woods. The silence of the dog's cry hung heavy in the air, a constant sound of memory, reminding them of the creature's killing power. They moved past a large, empty area of cleared ground, a buffer zone designed to protect the central structures. Just beyond this zone was the ammo building, a heavily fortified structure designed to hold explosives and ordnance. It was a thick concrete bunker surrounded by a secondary chain-link fence. It was not the final command post, but it was a central node and a logical point of attack or passage. They halted, pressing themselves against the cold, damp ground behind a low row of shrubs. Miller gave the hand signal for extreme caution. The silence was broken. They heard movement. It was a scraping, dragging sound far lighter than the noise the creature had made near their earlier bunker, but still unmistakably large. The sound originated from behind the heavily fortified ammo structure a couple of 100 yards away. It was a purposeful movement, a slow, methodical progression toward the central hub of the base. The creature was moving with the tactical intent of a predator, seeking the heart of the lair. The sealant despair instantly twisted into acute, actionable panic. The dragging sound behind the ammo structure had settled Sergeant Miller's course of action. They could not wait for the creature to complete its slow, methodical progress toward the center of the base. They had to intercept it, or at least intercept any friendly forces that might stumble into its path. The command post had to be warned. Raptor One moved quickly toward the fortified structure, using the long, cold shadows of the secondary fence line for cover. The ground was rocky here, and they moved with the studied precision of men who knew a single misstep could mean the difference between life and a brutal death. The danger was palpable, the air heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the promise of impending violence. As they crept past the corner of the ammo building, they saw movement ahead. It was another patrol team designated Raptor 2. The four men were moving cautiously but deliberately, clearly engaged in a pursuit of something large and fast. The sight of friendly forces brought a momentary surge of relief, quickly replaced by a wave of cold panic. Raptor 2 did not know what they were hunting. They would be operating on the assumption of a large animal or an opposing training unit. They were dangerously unprepared for a shape-shifting entity that knew how to kill with unnatural speed. Miller immediately pulled the dead radio handset to his mouth, his voice a desperate whisper. Raptor 2, this is Raptor 1. Abort chase. Repeat, abort immediately. It is not an animal. Do not engage. The radio responded only with a furious burst of static and a cacophony of distorted, high-pitched voices. There was yelling and commotion, the sounds of men under duress, but none of it was intelligible. Miller hammered the transmit button repeatedly, trying to cut through the noise, trying to force the simple truth through the wall of interference. The frustration was immense, a terrifying impotence in the face of imminent disaster. They were watching their comrades unknowingly blunder into a trap, and they could do nothing but whisper warnings into a dead handset. Specialist Diaz moved up beside Miller, his face pale in the green night vision light. He was watching the movement of Raptor 2. The patrol was focused entirely on the ground ahead, their attention locked on the pursuit. They were oblivious to the tactical impossibility of their situation. The pressure of the moment felt unbearable, a heavy weight of despair and urgency. Miller abandoned the voice transmission and tried to send a coded burst transmission, a desperate attempt to communicate the single fact of the supernatural threat. But the radio refused to cooperate, emitting only a flat, dead tone. The military equipment that was supposed to provide control and coordination was failing them completely, confirming the isolation they had felt earlier in the woods. Just as Raptor 2 vanished behind a cluster of low-lying barracks, a sudden transmission broke through the static field with chilling clarity. It was a frantic voice, choppy and stressed but perfectly understandable. Alpha Control, this is Raptor 2. We have made contact and are pursuing a large canine. Repeat. We are pursuing a large canine. We are running in a circular route to try to outflank whatever it was that they were chasing. The voice was the confirmation of their fatal misidentification, the tragic assumption that this was merely an animal. The security forces were pursuing a large canine. The transmission went dead, immediately swallowed once again by the static and the low, muffled sound of distant yelling. The squad looked at each other in horror. Raptor 2 had made contact with the shapeshifter. They were hunting a wolf when they should have been fleeing a monster. The urgency to intercept them before they engaged the beast directly became paramount. The tension peaked with the knowledge that the creature was now moving and engaged in a terrifying game of cat and mouse with friendly forces who were completely outmatched. They had to act now. Raptor One moved in a tight, frantic sprint toward the command post, their goal to intercept Raptor Two before they could corner the creature or be cornered by it. Sergeant Miller knew the other patrol was fatally underestimating the speed and nature of the beast, believing they were pursuing a mere large canine. The knowledge that they carried the terrible truth made their movement agonizingly urgent. As they cleared the long shadows of the barracks, another transmission sliced through the static, its intensity and fear level immediately spiking the tension. It was the voice of the pursuing patrol. "Alpha Control," it screamed. "The K9 is no longer running toward the fence. It is turning back. It is heading directly toward the command trailer." The information brought them to a sudden, horrified stop. The creature had changed its trajectory, displaying an intelligence that transcended simple flight or fight. It was heading toward the heart of the base, the one place where true communication and immediate support could be found. Then a new voice broke through the K1. Hut was thick with personal terror and a devastating, immediate abandonment. It was the voice of Alpha Control, the man inside the fortified command trailer. This man, the voice of institutional authority, spoke the ultimate betrayal. He said he was locking down. He said he was not opening the door until daylight. The words hung in the cold night air, a physical hammer blow that shattered the squad's last vestige of institutional hope. The sanctuary was gone. The central authority had surrendered to fear. The commander of the control post had chosen self-preservation over the safety of the men outside. This was the funny part of the original account, the horrifying reality of the man who locked himself in and refused to emerge until sunrise. The isolation was no longer geographical or electronic. It was institutional. The base itself had failed them. Reyes stared at Miller, his face pale and drawn in the green light. "We are the only ones left," he whispered. "The only ones who know what it is." The realization hit them with cold force. They were the sole repositories of the terrible truth, the only men with functional knowledge who were still outside the wire. Everyone else was either compromised by fear, locked in denial, or actively hunting a lie. The collapse of the system left them exposed and terrifyingly alone within their own perimeter. Miller ordered them to divert course. The command trailer was now a tomb, a place of certain entrapment. There was no point in racing toward a locked door. Instead, he ordered them toward a low hill overlooking the western fence line, the area they had just left. Their objectives shifted to overwatch and self-preservation. They would use their high ground position to watch for the creature's movement and perhaps provide some warning to any remaining patrols. The decision was a cold, necessary pivot from rescue to survival. They moved cautiously, their bodies heavy with the psychological weight of the abandonment. They were soldiers in a friendly war zone, rendered utterly helpless by the fear of their own command. The silence that followed the Alpha Control lockdown was filled with the bitter taste of betrayal and the rising sound of their own fear. Then the silence was violently ruptured again. It was not the frantic yelp of a dog or the confused yelling of a patrol. It was a single, massive, deep-throated howl that erupted from the very center of the base. The sound was immense, the full voice of the shapeshifter, no longer muffled or distorted. It carried across the entire perimeter a sound of savage triumph and total control. The howl confirmed that the creature was now in control of the core area, the command post, the supply routes. The base had fallen. The sound resonated in the cold air, a terrifying notification that the monster had claimed its new territory. Sergeant Miller immediately led the squad away from the compromised central area, moving quickly toward a small rocky overwatch position on a low hill that overlooked the western perimeter fence. The decision was born of cold desperation. The command post was a trap, and the central base was now the creature's territory. Their only chance was to gain elevation and attempt to observe the monster's movements. They scrambled up the hill, their bodies heavy with the weight of exhaustion and despair. The top of the hill was exposed bare rock and thin soil open to the cold German night wind. The atmosphere was one of a profound vulnerability, a place where they could be easily spotted, but which offered a wide, terrifying view of the base. The cold wind whipped across the exposed position, a chilling counterpoint to the heat of their exertion. They dropped prone behind a low cluster of sharp rocks, their night vision scopes instantly trained on the landscape. They switched back to their thermal settings, seeking the pale, distorted heat signature that had betrayed the creature in the deep woods hours earlier. The cold metal of the scope pressing against Reyes's eye was a sharp, physical reminder of their focus. From this elevated position, they could hear the muffled sounds of case emanating from the distant center of the base. It was not the distinct howl, but a series of broken, faint noises. They heard muffled yells. They heard the sound of distant breakage. They heard low, terrifyingly short screams that were swallowed almost instantly by the distance and the thick structures. The screams were the final confirmation of the ongoing attack. The shapeshifter was working its way through the command area unimpeded and unchallenged. Miller whispered the positions of the remaining structures, the barracks, the supply depots, the perimeter access gates. They scanned the ground around the ammo building and the command trailer, but saw only shadows and the muted green of the thermal scope. The creature was no longer running. It was hunting slowly, methodically inside the buildings. They held their breath, waiting for the creature to emerge, waiting for the final, terrifying confrontation. The minutes stretched into an agonizing duration of taunts, broken only by the cold wind and the distant muffled cries. The feeling was one of utter helplessness. They were observers in a tragedy unable to intervene. Then Corporal Hayes saw it. He was scanning the outer perimeter toward the area of the earlier fence breach. The thermal scope suddenly registered a massive, irregular heat signature. The creature had emerged from the central area and was moving back toward the woods. Hayes froze his breath, catching in his throat. He watched the massive shape move slowly toward a small cluster of thick fir trees 200 meters out from their position. The creature stopped at the tree line. It did not vanish into the foliage immediately. Instead, it leaned up against a tree, standing perfectly still on its hind legs. It turned its massive head slowly and stared directly up at the small, rocky hill where Raptor One was concealed. The immense figure was standing tall, a silent sentinel observing them. Hayes whispered the position through clenched teeth. 200 meters out. Miller. 2:00 clock position. It is leaning against a tree. It is watching us. The stare was the most chilling aspect of the confrontation. It was not the unseeing gaze of an animal, but the deliberate, conscious observation of an intelligent predator that knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. The creature knew it had been tracked. The creature knew it was being watched. The monster held the terrifying pose for a single, agonizing moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it turned its massive body and faded into the dark curtain of the leaves. It did not run. It simply melted away. They had been studied. They had been allowed to live. The silent sentinel was gone, leaving behind only the cold, crippling horror of its gaze, the sight of the creature leaning against the tree, 200 meters out, staring directly up. At the rocky hill where they were concealed, froze the squad into terrified stillness. Corporal Hayes's frantic whisper served as the only break in the suffocating silence. Sergeant Miller raised his binoculars, his own eyes confirming the impossible vision. The massive dark mass was standing on its hind legs, watching them with an intelligence that transcended the feral. Miller immediately whispered the position to the squad. 200 meters out. He commanded, his voice tight and controlled. 2:00 clock position. It is standing. Every man focused his scope on the terrifying sentinel. They were observing the creature, but they were equally aware that they were being observed in turn. The terror of the observation was worse than the initial confrontation. The creature was not posturing for an attack. It was not howling or growling. It was simply studying them. Its gaze was not the unseeing glare of a wild animal, but the calculated, chilling observation of a conscious predator, a mind that was assessing their capabilities and their threat level. The knowledge that they were being studied stripped away the last pretense of their military training. They were utterly outmatched by a superior intelligence. The stare lasted for a single, agonizing minute. It was a duration that stretched into eternity, a time during which every man realized they were not fleeing a dumb beast. They were trapped by a conscious entity that had chosen to engage them on a psychological level. The creature had breached the 9-foot fence. It had silenced the K9 patrol. It had laid siege to the command post, but it chose not to eliminate the small squad on the hill. It was a final, terrifying message. They were not worth the effort. They were merely witnesses. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of tactical choice, the creature turned its massive head away from the hill. It did not run. It did not charge. It simply faded silently into the leaves and the shadows of the woods. It was gone as cleanly and completely as it had arrived. The psychological shock was absolute. They had been allowed to live. The squad remained frozen on the cold rock, their bodies shaking with the residual adrenaline and the profound emptiness left by the creature's vanishing act. The memory of the intelligent stare lingered on their retinas, a terrifying imprint of conscious malice. They had confirmation that the shapeshifter was a thinking monster, capable of strategy and calculation. The chaos and the screams from the center of the base had quieted now, a silence that was more disturbing than the previous anesthesia. The creature's immediate business inside the perimeter seemed to be complete. After another 5 minutes of terrified stillness, the new sound came. It was the low, steady rumble of an engine approaching the base from the entry gate. It was the distinct sound of a utility vehicle moving at a controlled, non-emergency speed. Corporal Hayes identified the noise immediately. It is the Forestmeister Miller. They are sending in the cleanup crew. The arrival of the Forestmeister and the associated personnel marked the final terrible transition from the realm of the supernatural to the cold, hard reality of the bureaucratic cover-up. The military system had failed to defend itself, but it had not failed to respond with denial and censorship. The government was arriving to sweep the truth under the rug, to bag the bodies of the mutilated deer, and to silence the reports of the monster. The psychological terror of the creature was now replaced by the chilling, professional dread of the official lie. They had survived the monster, but now they had to survive the system. The sound of the utility vehicle belonging to the Forestmeister, pulling up to the entry gate, signaled the end of the immediate crisis phase and the beginning of the institutional cover-up. Sergeant Miller left the rest of Raptor One on the rocky overwatch position, with strict orders for absolute silence and vigilance. He descended the hill alone, heading toward the perimeter to sign in on the local authority. The Forestmeister was a large, quiet man who arrived shortly after 2:30 in the morning. Miller signed him in. At the entry gate, a quick bureaucratic formality that felt absurd, given the chaos that had just unfolded inside the perimeter. Miller escorted the Meister toward the scene of the carnage near the ammo building, explaining in a low, controlled voice everything that had happened. He described the initial finding of the dead deer, the impossible track, the sound of the deep, guttural growl, and the fact that the creature had returned to feed on the third deer. He told the Meister about the breach of the 9-foot fence and the terrifying silence that followed the dog's yelp. The Meister listened carefully, his face betraying no emotion. His silence was not born of disbelief, but of sheer professionalism, suggesting he had dealt with this specific incident, or something very similar before. He carried himself with the heavy, unhurried posture of a man who understood the rules of the woods and the secrets they held. They arrived at the scene of the mutilated deer. The sickly sweet scent of the blood and raw meat was stronger here, an oppressive smell that lingered in the cold air. The Meister crouched down, examining the carcasses with a meticulous, practiced eye. He ran his gloved hand over the torn throats and the consumed hindquarters. He worked slowly, confirming the horror of the scene. He confirmed Miller's earlier suspicion that it did not appear to be the work of a wild boar. He said that the wounds had all the markings of a wolf attack, but the pattern of the kill was wrong. Wolves usually did not kill their prey outright. Their typical method was to wound the animal and then wait for it to collapse from shock or blood loss before consuming the internal organs while it was still alive. But it looked as if this one just straight up killed the deer and started eating, as evidenced by the severe neck injuries. The Meister was confused, but his confusion was technical, not emotional. He took a series of photographs of the carcasses for the official records, a cold, bureaucratic documentation of the terrifying event. He then produced thick plastic bags and began the slow, grim task of bagging up the bodies for removal. The physical evidence of the shapeshifter's rampage was being systematically erased. Miller watched him work the chilling professionalism of the cover-up, replacing the immediate fear of the creature. He waited until the Meister was nearly finished with the third deer before asking the question that had plagued them since they found the mangled fence. Miller asked if a wolf could jump a 9-foot fence. He spoke the question softly, watching the Meister's face for any flicker of surprise or denial. The Meister stood up slowly, pulling off his gloves, his expression completely neutral. He paused for a long moment, looking from the torn fence section to Miller's serious, exhausted face. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, a small gesture of complicity and profound resignation. "This one could," he replied, his voice low and toneless. He paused again, then offered a small, unsettling laugh that held no humor. The answer was the final confirmation of the local knowledge and the conspiracy. The local authority knew exactly what the beast was and what it was capable of doing. The laugh was chilling, a shared secret between the soldier who had witnessed the impossible and the local man who was tasked with hiding the truth. Miller felt a cold sense of forced compliance settle over him. He had faced the monster, but now he had to face the powerful system designed to protect the lie. Sergeant Miller returned to the rest of Raptor One after escorting the Forest Meister and confirmed the grim reality of the official cover-up. The beast was gone, and the evidence was being removed. Now the system would require them to participate in the lie. The remaining patrols were ordered to report back to the security trailer to write their official statements before the shift ended at 06:30 in the morning. The psychological atmosphere was thick with bureaucratic dread. The entire squad was exhausted and deeply traumatized by the sights they had witnessed and the sounds they had heard. They discussed the immediate consequences of reporting the unbelievable truth. Private Reyes muttered that they were all going to have to pee in a bottle, meaning a routine analysis to see if they were on drugs, a standard military procedure when personnel report something that defies reality. The idea that their profound terror would be dismissed as a hallucination or a chemical imbalance was an insult to their sanity. They arrived at the small security trailer and were handed the cold, smooth report forms. The touch of the paper was unnervingly mundane, a physical object demanding a narrative that could not possibly be written within the bounds of military regulation. They knew that submitting the truth about a creature that stood on its hind legs and jumped a 9-foot fence would mark them instantly as unreliable. Before Miller could begin writing his account, he was pulled aside by his flight chief and his shift commander, who had arrived on scene to manage the fallout. Miller briefed them on everything he had witnessed again, detailing the tracks, the attack on the canine unit, and the sheer unnatural power of the creature. His superiors listened with wasted, non-committal expressions. The flight chief then presented Miller with the cold, hard reality of the institutional choice. He spoke in a low-level voice, designed to enforce obedience, not to offer comfort. He laid out two options. "We could turn in the statements, but we omit the werewolf references," he said. "Or we shred the statements entirely and write in the official logbook that a wild animal had killed some deer in the wooded area behind the ammo building, and that the forestmeister had been dispatched. End of story." The implication was clear and terrifying. The flight chief emphasized that if they chose to go with the werewolf thing, their personnel reliability program would be immediately called into question. The PRP was the essential security clearance that enabled them to work around sensitive resources on Air Force bases. To lose their PRP would not only cast a dark cloud over their entire career, but it would result in them being assigned to crap details while being re-evaluated, a process that usually took up to 45 days. The threat was not physical punishment, but bureaucratic strangulation. The military was forcing them to choose their careers over the impossible truth. Miller returned to the small table and looked at his exhausted squad. He relayed the superior officer's ultimatum. They did not need to debate the moral consequence. The weight of their careers, the certainty of the punishment, and the knowledge that no one would ever believe the truth made the choice inevitable. They looked at each other in silence, a mutual acknowledgement of the lie they were about to participate in. They collectively opted for the latter. They would trade the truth for their professional survival. They would report the official lie. The heavy, crushing feeling of resignation settled over the trailer. They would become complicit in the cover-up, victims of both the creature and the system that failed to acknowledge its existence. The decision had been made in silence, a mutual, defeated understanding that the impossible truth was too heavy for the military system to bear. They would not risk their careers, their clearance, or their futures for a monster that defied all regulations. Sergeant Miller collected the original handwritten reports, the accounts that detailed the pale crawler, the 9-foot jump, and the intelligent stare. These documents containing the full, terrible truth had to be destroyed. They moved to a small, loud paper shredder in the corner of the security trailer. The sound of the machine was jarring, a low, grating mechanical whine that dominated the post-trauma silence of the small room. Miller fed the first page into the machine. The crisp, cold paper was immediately grabbed and pulled into the steel teeth. The rasping sound of the paper being shredded was terrifyingly final, a mechanical consumption of the truth. It was a sound of absolute erasure, a permanent destruction of the evidence. One by one, the truthful accounts were fed to the machine. Private Reyes watched the white strips of paper fall into the plastic bin, a silent metaphor for their sanity and their honesty being torn into unrecognizable pieces. The act of shredding was symbolic. It was the formal agreement to participate in the lie, a psychological burial of their shared terror. Corporal Hayes and Specialist Diaz then began the process of writing the sanitized version. The official entry in the logbook was clipped and sterile. It simply stated that a large wild animal had killed some deer in the wooded area behind the ammo building, and that the forestmeister had been dispatched to remove the carcasses. End of story. The record was complete. The investigation was closed. The official lie was cemented into the history of the base. The creature was reduced to a wild animal, its supernatural menace successfully contained by the power of the bureaucratic denial. The squad finally left the security trailer. as the faint light of the early morning began to seep over the perimeter fence. The time was 06:30, the shift officially over. They returned to their barracks, their bodies exhausted and their minds overloaded. The physical threat was gone, but the psychological wound remained raw. They were now bound together not only by the terror they had witnessed, but by the terrible secret they were forced to keep. The quiet horror of being forced to participate in a lie settled over them, a persistent, internalized fear that would define their lives going forward. They could not speak the truth. They could not report the terror. They were alone with their secret inside the massive, cold structure of the military base. As Miller reached the barracks, he paused by the bulletin board, where the duty roster for the next shift was posted. The roster was not supposed to be finalized yet, but the names were already printed on the new sheet. Miller scanned the assignments, looking for the names of Raptor One. He found them grouped together under a single entry. The four names Miller, Hayes, Diaz, and Reyes were all assigned to the same patrol. It was through the same remote sector, the deep woods that bordered the ancient shrine, the area where the creature had first revealed itself. It was very rare to have the same patrol twice, let alone being assigned to the same area. The sight of the roster brought a wave of cold, heavy foreboding. It was not a mistake. The military command knew the incident had occurred. They knew the terrain had been compromised. And yet they were intentionally sending the same group of soldiers who knew the truth back into the most dangerous sector. The assignment was a punishment, or perhaps a chilling display of the system's complete lack of concern for their safety. The terror was not over. The institutional details was a silent command for them to return to the void. The perpetual cycle of dread had begun. The morning light brought no relief to the four men of Raptor One. They were back on the bus, heading toward the dark confines of the German woods, their bodies physically exhausted and their minds psychologically scarred by the events of the previous night. The bus ride was quiet, a silence thicker than any they had experienced in the forest. It was the heavy silence of a shared terrible secret, the knowledge that they had traded the truth for their careers. They were bound together by the lie, the betrayal of their duty, and the profound understanding that the monster was real. Sergeant Miller sat at the front, his eyes fixed on the winding road. He carried the weight of the moral choice, the decision to shred the truth and participate in the cover-up. He knew that the only way to survive the next shift was to acknowledge the rules of the terrain and the true nature of their enemy, a nature that transcended military strategy and required adherence to ancient, desperate folklore. As the bus approached the perimeter of the training area, Miller ordered the driver to stop. He explained quietly that he needed to check a piece of equipment near the roadside. He left the bus alone, walking back down the road to the small, inconspicuous stone shrine that marked the unofficial boundary between the training grounds and the quiet civilian world. He had to ensure that the candle was lit. Miller approached the altar, moving slowly and cautiously. The air around the shrine was cold but clean, carrying only the scent of pine and damp rock. He found the candle protected by the rough slate slabs. The small flame, which had been dangerously close to extinguishing itself the previous night, was now burning strongly. It was a firm, steady point of orange light, a silent beacon in the perpetual gloom of the forest edge. The sight was both hopeful and intensely eerie. It was a powerful, hypnotic light that suggested that the local population, the people who understood the rules of the darkness, had ensured their ancient protector remained vigilant. The steady flame was a ritualistic confirmation of the boundary, a non-military safeguard that held the ancient evil at bay. Miller realized that the survival of the squad was now tied not to their weapons or their training, but to the continued perseverance of this single, fragile, burning wick. He stared into the flame, allowing the light to burn the lingering dread from his eyes. He was performing his own silent pact. with the ancient protector acknowledging the power of the legend. He knew that the candle was a physical manifestation of the local fear, a constant vigil maintained against the vengeful spirit that the legends claimed was held at bay so long as the light kept burning. The flame was a thin shield, a testament to centuries of Quate's terrified complacency. Miller turned his back on the strong solitary light and returned to the bus, his mind slightly steadier, his resolve hardened by the sight of the successful ritual. He was no longer taking any chances. They continued the short drive to their assigned patrol sector. The sector was deep in the woods, the exact area where the perpetual loop had trapped them, and the pale crawler had first been sighted. Miller ensured the team was moving with extreme caution, their eyes sweeping the tree line, their hands resting lightly on the cold escalates barrels of their rifles. The silence of the deep woods was different now. It was not the oppressive silence of a vacuum, but a heavy, listening silence, a sound that seemed to wait for them. They had walked only 50 meters into the perimeter of their assigned sector when the silence was broken. It was a low, familiar growl. It was not the massive, triumphant howl they had heard from the center of the base. This was the low, guttural growl that they had heard inside the bunker, the sound of a creature confirming its presence and its territorial claim. The sound did not come from the direction of the base or the perimeter fence. It came from the depth of the forest, from the thickest tangle of ancient trees. The beast was waiting for them. The sound was a chilling notification that the shapeshifter was back in its territory, and its hunting shift had begun anew. The terror had returned exactly where they had left it. The low, familiar growl that echoed from the deep woods was no longer a shock. It was a signal. It was a confirmation that the creature was waiting. Its presence was no longer a surprise, but an established, terrifying fact of their new reality. The 2 hours they had been forced to spend away from this sector, the brief, desperate detour into the civilian world, and the command trailer chaos had changed nothing. The monster had simply returned to its territory, and it was waiting for them to arrive. Sergeant Miller did not need to give orders. The 4 men of Raptor One moved into the NC silently, taking up their defensive positions among the gnarled roots and dark shadows of the deepest trees. They moved with the cold, practiced precision of men who had accepted their fate. They were not here to escape. They were here to endure. The only difference tonight was the knowledge they carried a terrible weight of truth that separated them from every other soldier on the base. They knew they faced a shape-shifting monster, being of immense, unnatural power. They knew the 9-foot fence was useless. They knew the command structure had deliberately abandoned them. They knew they were exhausted and unarmed by protocol against a creature that operated outside the laws of man and nature. They settled into the dark, their eyes scanning the green-tinted world through the lenses of their night vision scopes. The sensory focus was now internal, a quiet concentration on the rhythmic sounds of their own bodies. The primary sound was the heavy, repetitive breathing of the 4 men, their breath ragged and shallow in the cold air. It was a hypnotic pattern, a constant, low-level drumming in the silence. It was the sound of constant vigilance, the unceasing rhythm of men entrapped in a cycle of profound dread. The night was not about fighting the creature. It was about watching. It was about waiting. It was about forcing their terrified minds to maintain the hypnotic rhythm of the never-ending watch. The horror was now existential, a quiet realization that their situation was permanent. The beast, the woods, and the lie had become their perpetual prison. They were trapped in a cyclical nightmare, one that would repeat every night that they were assigned to this forbidden sector. Private Reyes felt the cold dampness of the earth soaking into his uniform, but the physical discomfort was secondary to the chilling fact of the creature's known presence. He knew that the only way to survive was to accept the constant, low-level hum of fear as a new normal, a new layer of his operational reality. The monster was out there, a massive silent shadow, waiting for the candle at the shrine to fail, waiting for their guard to drop, waiting for the exhaustion to finally consume their sanity. Corporal Hayes watched the tree line, his rifle resting across his forearm. He knew the creature could assume any form. He knew the creature could be right in front of him, concealed within the familiar outline of a tree trunk or a patch of heavy shadow. The true terror was the constant necessity of doubting his own senses, of questioning the visual reality presented by his equipment. His mind was a battlefield, and the enemy was the doubt planted there by the shapeshifter. The memory of the intelligent stare, the conscious observation from 200 meters away, was a persistent, terrifying fact that burned in Sergeant Miller's mind. The monster knew them. The monster was patient. It was not a question of if it would return to attack. It was a question of when and in what form. The silence was its hunting ground, and their frantic, rhythmic breathing was the only proof of their fragile, temporary survival. The low, guttural growl that had signaled the creature's return slowly faded into the immense, unanswerable silence of the haunted German woods. It did not disappear instantly. It receded inch by inch, a slow, deliberate sound that left behind a heavy wake of profound, lasting dread. The silence that replaced the growl was not peaceful. It was expectant. It was a promise. It was the absolute quiet of the night waiting for the dawn that would never fully cleanse the woods. The watch had begun. The horror was now their reality. The perpetual cycle of the beast, the woods, and the lie would continue, promising a slow, inevitable return. The end was not a bang. It was a sustained, terrible silence